At 8:10 in the morning, a fault that doesn't exist on any official map ruptured beneath the mountains of Mendocino County. 10 million people felt it. 80,000 felt it hard enough to break dishes, crack walls, and knock out power. And when seismologists rushed to plot the epicenter, they found something that shouldn't have been possible. The earthquake hadn't come from the San Andreas. It hadn't come from any fault line California had ever officially recorded. This is the story of what happened when the ground beneath Northern California moved along a line nobody knew was there, and what scientists discovered afterward that has changed the way an entire state thinks about its own risk. To understand why this matters, you have to understand where this happened. Redwood Valley sits about 120 miles north of San Francisco, tucked into wine country and dense forest in Mendocino County. It's quiet, rural, the kind of place most people associate with vineyards, not seismic catastrophe. But underneath that calm landscape runs one of the most geologically complicated regions in the United States. California isn't held together by a single fault. It's cut apart by dozens of them. The San Andreas gets the headlines, but running parallel to it, slicing through the same stretch of Earth, are other systems most people have never heard of. The Macama Fault, the Bartlett Springs Fault, and as of that Wednesday morning, something in between the two that has no name at all. For decades, the working assumption was straightforward. Scientists knew where the major faults were. They knew, roughly, how much stress had built up along each one, and they used that to estimate risk. Redwood Valley wasn't considered a high-priority earthquake zone. There was no headline fault running directly beneath it. That, scientists believed, made it safer than places like Los Angeles or the Bay Area, where the San Andreas and San Jacinto systems dominate every risk assessment. That assumption just failed a real-world test. At 8:10 a.m. local time on June 24th, a magnitude 5.6 earthquake tore loose about 7 miles north of Redwood Valley at a depth of roughly 5 miles. Within minutes, aftershocks followed, a 2.5, then a 2.7, then a 2.6, rippling outward from the same patch of ground. The shaking reached intensity levels of 6 to 8 on the modified Mercalli scale, strong enough, engineers say, to crack roads, damage older buildings, and in the worst hit spots, cause partial structural collapse. Roughly 17,000 people live in the zone that experienced the most severe shaking. The tremor was felt as far away as Sacramento, 140 miles to the southeast. Most of the population of the nearby town of Willits lost power entirely, but it was what happened after the shaking stopped that turned this into something bigger than a routine California quake. When USGS scientists mapped the aftershock sequence, they expected to see a clean line, the signature of a single fault slipping in one direction. Instead, they found a band of seismicity running between two known faults, in a location where no fault trace had ever been documented. Not in the USGS Quaternary Faults and Folds database, not in the California Geological Survey's records. The earthquake's focal mechanism, the physical signature of how the rock actually broke, pointed toward an alignment consistent with the Macama fault system. But the rupture itself occurred somewhere the map said there was nothing. Stop for a second. Let that sink in. A fault capable of producing a magnitude 5.6 earthquake, enough to injure people, damage infrastructure, and cut power to an entire town, existed in a populated part of California, and nobody had documented it. Researchers have since linked the activity to a 2013 academic paper that had flagged unusual seismicity in the area over a decade earlier, evidence that was sitting in the scientific literature the entire time, waiting to be connected to a real event. Now zoom out, because this isn't an isolated anomaly. It's part of a much larger pattern that scientists have been tracking with growing alarm across the entire state. Just 1 week before the Redwood Valley quake, a research team from the University of Hawaiʻi at Manoa published findings on tectonic stress across the San Andreas and San Jacinto fault systems in Southern California. Their conclusion? Stress along these faults has climbed to the highest level recorded in the past 1,000 years. Several fault segments, the researchers determined, are now in what they call a critically loaded state. The lead author put it bluntly, this is not a distant theoretical risk. If that stress continues to build along the fault segments south of Redwood Valley, seismologists Seismologists warn the state faces a scenario it hasn't seen since 2019, when the Ridgecrest sequence began with a magnitude 6.4 quake and escalated within 34 hours into a 7.1 main shock, California's largest earthquake in 2 decades. Researchers have identified a specific structural feature called Cajon Pass, a junction between the San Andreas and San Jacinto systems, that can act as what one scientist described as an earthquake gate, sometimes blocking a rupture from spreading between fault systems and sometimes letting it pass straight through, turning a contained event into something far larger. To understand what a critically loaded fault actually means, picture a spring that's been slowly compressed for 100 years. Tectonic plates in California are grinding past each other at roughly the same rate a fingernail grows, a couple of centimeters a year. That motion doesn't happen smoothly. It gets locked in place by friction, and stress builds up silently, invisibly, for decades or centuries, until the rock can no longer hold the tension. When it finally gives way, all that stored energy releases at once. A critically loaded fault is a spring near its breaking point, and the unnamed fault near Redwood Valley shows that some of these springs aren't even on the map yet. There's a second layer to this that most coverage missed entirely. Faults don't operate in isolation. They talk to each other. When one section of crust slips, it doesn't just release stress locally. It transfers a portion of that stress onto neighboring segments, sometimes miles away, nudging them closer to their own breaking point. Seismologists call this process stress triggering, and it's one of the reasons a moderate earthquake in one location can be a warning sign for a completely different fault system nearby. Picture pressing your thumb into one spot on an overripe piece of fruit. The skin doesn't just bruise where you pressed. The pressure radiates outward, weakening the flesh around it in ways you can't see from the surface. That's roughly what happens underground when a fault like the one near Redwood Valley ruptures next to a dense, poorly mapped network of smaller faults. Nobody can say with certainty which segment absorbs that stress next. But the fact that it happened at all in a location with no name and no history of major activity tells researchers the entire regional model needs a second look. The consequences of getting this wrong extend far beyond one rural valley. 10 million people in Northern California alone felt this earthquake to some degree. Beyond the immediate shaking, the earthquake exposed a deeper vulnerability. The models used to calculate insurance risk, building codes, and emergency preparedness across the state are built on the assumption that known faults represent the primary danger. An undocumented fault capable of a damaging magnitude 5.6 event means those models are working with incomplete information in a state where more than 39 million people live within reach of active seismic zones. When an entire town loses power from what was, geologically speaking, a moderate event, the real question isn't what happened in Mendocino County. It's how many more of these hidden faults are sitting quietly beneath cities that assume they already know their risk. Emergency planners in Mendocino and Sonoma counties are now reviewing whether building codes calibrated to older fault maps adequately account for a source this close to residential areas. That review alone could take months, and in the meantime, the fault responsible for the June 24th rupture remains active, undergoing continued aftershock activity that seismologists are logging in near real time. For residents in Willits and the surrounding valley, the aftermath has meant something more immediate than academic debate. Insurance adjusters have been documenting structural damage, building by building, and utility crews spent days restoring power to homes that lost it in the initial shaking. Local officials have started distributing updated earthquake preparedness guidance, this time explicitly acknowledging that the previous hazard maps understated the risk in their own backyard. That's a hard thing for a community to hear, that the ground you've lived on for generations was never as well understood as everyone assumed. Multiply that valley by every quiet, unmapped patch of crust running through a state of 39 million people, and the scale of what's still unknown starts to come into focus. So what happens now? USGS seismologists are actively working to formally classify and name the fault segment responsible for the June 24th earthquake. using the aftershock data to trace its full extent underground. Meanwhile, the University of Hawaiʻi team's stress models are being used to identify which segments of the San Andreas and San Jacinto systems are closest to failure, with particular attention on Kaijan Pass and its role as a potential rupture pathway between fault systems. The signal scientists say they're watching most closely is a sudden increase in background seismicity along already known critically loaded segments, the kind of quiet, unremarkable activity that historically has preceded major ruptures. Whether that signal is building right now is something researchers may not know until the ground moves again. Subscribe to stay ahead of what's coming.